Last week, we heard the story of how, by being attentive to God's dreams and visions, Joseph had managed to save his family and the entire nation of Egypt from a severe famine that struck the land. We discovered together how God had used an upstart younger brother who had been stripped of his dignity and humanity and sold into slavery to liberate and save the very ones that had imprisoned and oppressed him in the first place. You would think then that the story of Joseph might act as something of a cautionary tale, a warning against oppressing others, lest we find ourselves working against the very saving acts of God. Perhaps even acting against our own salvation. Yet, our reading this week once again begins with a tale of violence and oppression. Some time has passed, we hear, and a new Pharaoh has risen in the land of Egypt. And this Pharaoh has not bothered to learn from history. It is either beneath him, or perhaps inconvenient to his lust for power. But we are told that this Pharaoh is ignorant of how God had used an Israelite, a foreigner, an outsider, to save his people in generations past. Instead, Pharaoh has elected to sow seeds of fear and paranoia and reap a harvest of blood. For Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the land, who commands the army, the treasury, and the very gods of Egypt themselves, has decided that his power is somehow threatened by this group of foreigners. And so, he stands up in the halls of power and proclaims, We are in danger of being swamped by Israelites. Now, whether Pharaoh believes in his own delusions is unclear. The reading does not tell us whether Pharaoh is genuinely made paranoid and afraid by his lust for power, or if indeed this is simply a cynical political ploy to appeal to the worst instincts of his people. And perhaps Pharaoh's motivation doesn't matter. The fruits of his rhetoric are just as deadly either way. Ruthlessly imprisoning and enslaving an entire group of people, and ordering the vile murder of any Hebrew boys. You see, once you choose to demonize an entire group of people, seeking to purge them from existence is only a small step away, for you have made them less than human. And if this story sounds familiar to you, perhaps it should. For such acts of demonization, oppression, and violence are not the sole ownership of any one pharaoh, but the common tool of empire throughout history. Spain during the Inquisition, Germany in the 1930s, Bethlehem with the birth of a small baby fleeing the murderous intentions of Herod. Today, perhaps, closer to home. History does not repeat itself, Mark Twain is reputed to have said, but it often rhymes. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Ironically, though, this might be good news. Because as the story of Joseph revealed to us, our God has a history of showing up in unexpected ways when oppression is at its very worst and subverting it for the sake of the kingdom. So why not now? Why not now as well? Yet upon hearing the plight of the Israelites in today's reading, one would not blame them for losing hope. From circumstances beyond their control, they have found themselves prisoners to a system of injustice in which they have no voice and no power. Now, I'd like you to imagine something with me for a moment, particularly those of you who are parents and grandparents. Imagine for a moment the utter grief, the tearing apart of your chest as your newborn child is ripped from your arms as a matter of government policy. As a matter of government policy. Wouldn't you collapse in a screaming heap of agony? Wouldn't you curl up in a ball of rage? I think I might simply cease functioning as a person. And I'm pretty sure I would find myself wondering where the hell God could possibly be in the midst of this. Where is this God who promised us a land in Canaan? Where is this God who promised us children and descendants as our children are taken from our hands? Where is this God who promised to make us a great nation, not just a race of enslaved animals? These questions are logical. They are a rational response to the most horrendous of circumstances. And so I find myself deeply captured and captivated in this story by the faith of two women whose names most of us have probably never heard. Shiphrah and Puah. Shiphrah and Puah. These two women, we are told, are Hebrew midwives. And to be clear, in a passage which is all about the Hebrew people being enslaved, this means that these midwives are also slaves. They have no status, no power. To disobey the commands of a master for them almost certainly means death. And these two women, these nobodies, are brought before the most powerful man in Egypt, a walking God on earth in his own theology, and given the command to kill all the baby Israelite boys. And not only do they actively disobey Pharaoh, but they also outwit and trick him, lying to his face about what they have done. For these women, Shiphrah and Puah, who have everything to lose, they are not afraid of Pharaoh. For they fear God. They fear God. They understand where true power rests, and that it isn't in the paranoid ramblings of a man who would be king, but in the compassion of a God who has called them to be a people. So these women perform the one simple act of defiance open to them, at great risk to themselves, because it is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. And in this, they are not alone, for there are another two women and a young girl in this story who each actively disobey Pharaoh's orders, including Pharaoh's own daughter, who disobeys the command to all Egyptians to throw any Hebrew boys into the river. These women actively disobey Pharaoh. But I wonder if we would. Would we be willing to break the law for the sake of God's justice? Would we be willing to risk death at the hands of those more powerful than us? Would we disobey our own government or family to save the life of even one foreign child who had been scapegoated for political gain? There is a time when being faithful means disobeying Pharaoh. There is a time when being faithful means disobeying Pharaoh. And that's utterly terrifying. For in the face of evil and injustice, we can feel too small and too powerless and too unskilled to act. How can I make a difference in the face of this? And more than that, many of us were raised to believe that being a good Christian also meant being an obedient citizen. In Western Christendom, where the state, the government, took over the church, being a faithful Christian meant being a good Australian or American or Brit or wherever you happened to call home. The idea that being a person of faith might sometimes mean disobeying the law seems then utterly outrageous, and at the very least may leave us feeling deeply uncomfortable. One of my great fears is that we as humans lack the discernment to know when we should obey the law and when we should break it. When are we truly acting for God's justice in the world? Or when are we instead acting out of our own selfishness or comfort or lust for power? As I suspect might be the case around some of those invoking God's name in order to refuse wearing a mask during COVID. Perhaps there's a difference between breaking the law for the sake of preserving life and breaking the law in order to endanger it. Yet despite our objections, these 5 fierce, faithful women dared to disobey Pharaoh. And we are forced to wrestle with this reality because of what God does next. For God does not condemn the women for their acts of defiance. Instead, God deals well with them and uses the fruit of their labor, a child called Moses, to liberate all of Israel from Pharaoh's violence. And this is the good news of this passage. God takes simple acts of disobedience by those without power and transforms them into acts of God's own salvation. Let me say that again. God takes these simple acts of disobedience by the ones without power and transforms them into acts of God's very own salvation. God is moving. God is at work. Now, of course, this still might not sound like good news to those of us who have always benefited from Pharaoh and his laws. It certainly does not answer our questions or overcome many of our objections. It may not leave us feeling any wiser or more empowered to act. But let's be clear. For those who are currently enslaved and oppressed, or for those that we as a nation have played a part in demonizing and dehumanizing, this is nothing short of the promise of God's presence and deliverance. It is a revelation that Pharaoh's reign of cruelty is doomed to come undone at the hands of God's compassion. And it is the truth that we can only be the people of God. We are only made the people of God by the grace of a God who takes who we are and what we do and transforms us and them for the sake of Christ's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So may we find God at work in the smallest acts of justice and disobedience. For Pharaoh's violent reign is ended, and God's people are free. Amen. There's going to be some time now for reflection, to listen for what God might be saying to you in the passage.